My name is Iye Collective. I'm originally from the eastern part of Cuba, Santiago de Cuba, and I mix heritage with Haitian, Congolese, French, a bit of everything, but I didn't identify myself as an Afro-Cuban.
My Sinchothan name is Reclamation, and that name comes from my great-great-grandfather from Malahat across the water here from Sartlet. And I come from the village site of Sayout on the Saanich Peninsula.
When you ask me about who I am, the first thing that comes to mind is my nationality, because I do have a really strong tie to my land. So I was born and raised in the Bahamas, Freeport, Grand Bahama, the most northern island. And both of my parents are also Bahamian. My mother, on my mom's side, her mother is Bahamian and her father is from Britain. And then on my dad's side, as far back as we can trace it, he's Bahamian. So I have like a lot of very strong ties in the Bahamas and a lot of family.
CM school kitana kwatin talkwain ni khito lalamecha natana walmox aslins at the walmox slakan o high tapka.
At that time, my grandparents, they escaped communism and they came to Canada looking for more freedom. I grew up in a family-run business.
We were really inspired and doing our own thing, and then we were like, this is a need in the community. And such a need because we realized that all food security and food sovereignty projects in town are unfortunately catered to and by white people.
Welcome back to Canada's Social Changemakers. In this interview series, I've been chatting with some pretty amazing Canadians doing really wonderful things. And this episode is absolutely no different. I have a true social justice warrior with me today, Jumana Risheq, who is a second generation Palestinian refugee born in Jordan. She is now involved with the food sovereignty movement, with traditional medicine, land rights, immigration and refugee rights, as well as independent films and media. So it's an absolute pleasure to be able to speak with her today. And just before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin-speaking peoples, also known as the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations, and I'm in Saanich, which is part of the Saanich Nations as well. So thank you so much, Jumana, for speaking with me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Justin. I really appreciate being here.
You know, some of the work that you're doing is so amazing, and I really want to introduce everyone to the work that you're doing. But just to get things started, and so we can learn a little bit more about you, can you talk a little bit about your upbringing in Jordan and how you made the process and move over to Canada?
Most definitely. Yeah, I actually was just having a wonderful conversation with somebody about identity and belonging surrounding my story. So my family is a Palestinian family, and my grandmother's generation was the first one to experience exile during the occupation in 1948. And so my family went to Lebanon first, and then in the war was exiled then to Kuwait, and then from Kuwait exiled then to Jordan. So I was the first of my family to be born outside of the context of war. So I was born in Jordan with Jordanian citizenship as a second generation Palestinian refugee. And I spent most of my youth there, and we moved to Ontario when I was about 7 years old for the first time. And we stayed until I was about 14, and then we moved back to Jordan. And then when I was living in Jordan, I had the opportunity to spend some time also living in Nepal, working with Tibetan refugees in Kathmandu. And then afterwards, I had to choose where I wanted to go to school in the world. And when I found out about Vancouver Island, I got really excited. I thought I would be surfing, but then I got here and the water was too cold. So I just moved right over. And originally I moved here in order to go to Vancouver Island University because I was pursuing the study of political science and international relations. I'd spent most of my teenage years working actively in the Palestinian and Syrian refugee camps in Jordan. And I was really passionate about the idea of getting into the political realm because I didn't feel like there was many people in the political sphere that were coming with the kind of background of having actually been refugees and having the understanding of those communities. The deeper I got into the political sphere, the more I became increasingly frustrated with the kind of bureaucracy and corruption that I was seeing within that field. And I realized that the impact that I was really interested in having through my work was a lot more focused on community-centered work and a lot more about being on the ground with folks, getting their stories and creating impact which changed the day-to-day experience of folks who have experienced diaspora and lived in disenfranchised communities. So I took some time off of school at that point in time. And then I made my way back to understanding these things things through land-based connections. So I started studying traditional bodies of medicine and land tending and land stewardship, which took me to my education at Pacific Rim College, which included traditional herbal medicine, phytotherapy is what they call it, Ayurvedic nutrition, permaculture, and resilient ecosystem design. Halfway through that educational process, I got the opportunity to get mentored and initiated by some elder medicine women in the Bedouin tribes of Ba'amarin in southern Jordan. And that was the first time that I truly felt a restoration of the sense of belonging as a child of diaspora from the Palestinian lands. What a lot of people don't know is prior to the British partition after the fall of the Ottomans, Palestine and Transjordan were actually considered the same landmass. So my ancestry existed on both of those lands, and living in connection with the desert and learning the traditional indigenous ways of the Bedouins was a huge way that changed my entire approach and my entire understanding of what it meant to live in reciprocity and indigeneity. And so then I went back and I finished my education. And since then, I've been working with a collective here called the Iye Collective, which I've really quite enjoyed. Anybody who doesn't know about them, check them out. We're doing some.
We're going to get all into, we're going to break down all of those. I mean, you've already said so many things.
There. Yeah.
But anyway, so now that I have you again, I would just want to first touch on the immigration, refugee, working in refugee camps in Jordan, in Nepal. I know my background, I've mentioned to you when we were speaking, is in immigration refugee law. That's where I articled in Toronto.
Yes.
I have a lot of strong feelings about it, but maybe can you share a little bit about your experience working in refugee camps and how that shaped some of your worldviews?
Yeah, for me, I mean, there's a lot of nuances if we wanted to talk about policy and law and politics, but for me, the deepest impact that it had was on a very humanistic level. I got the opportunity to sit with a lot of folks that were living in the refugee camps and listen to their stories about what was the real grief they were experiencing through diaspora. What were the things that they felt were the keys of this sense of belonging and that had been lost in transit? And what were the things that were really asking for in terms of impact? Of course, all of them felt this longing to go home to the lands from which they had been exiled. But then the questions would open up about what is home to you? What does home constitute? And what could become home in a new land that you find yourself taking refuge in? And it all kind of came back to this principle of a relationship of reciprocity with land, place, and culture. And food was a huge component of it, you know? And when I say food here, I don't just mean the process of eating. I mean all 6 stages of food, which is the relationship to the land, the soil, the ecosystems, the seasons, the cultures around growing, the cultures around harvesting, eating, sharing, telling stories, sharing with the entire community this experience. And some of the experiences I went through as well was the nuances of identity within these communities. Being a second generation refugee, I was just having a wonderful conversation about this with a colleague of mine, Asiya. It's very complex, right? Because as we build our identities as refugees and as immigrants, each land that we are then raised by becomes a part of the identity. And there's this holding on to this concept of a motherland, but also this new relationship that's being built to the lands that we exist in. So my question became, not how much money or how many policies or law changes we need to implement, but rather how do we actually stand side by side in solidarity with each other as second generation, third generation refugees and immigrants, taking our position of privilege of having landed and belonged to a new land to help with the integration and the healing of diaspora, which exists within refugee communities. And so for me, I'm a lot more concerned with the humanistic aspect of these things. I think policy and law and engagement in this way is very important. But my real heartbeat is the rehumanization of the conversation, getting onto the ground and understanding that we are all people searching for a sense of home. And even for those of us living here in Canada that are third generation Canadians, fourth generation Canadians, we all came from somewhere. And reconnecting to those roots and understanding those roots and the interplay of cultural integration rather than assimilation, I think is a really key piece to how we address diasporic dissonance, is what I call it. And so that was the really key piece for me, because that kind of stretched across from Palestinian camps, Syrian camps, Tibetan camps. It really all came back down to language, to stories, to songs, to foods, to lands. That was the real sense of loss. And that's why storytelling and independent filmmaking is something that I have found myself drawn towards, because I think the art of being able to regenerate and reinvigorate and share the stories that have been silenced, lost, or stolen in our communities is really a gateway and a key towards understanding what is it that is lacking in our narrative about how to create cultures that are integrative. I think in Canada, we really pride ourselves on this idea of multiculturalism. We've never really had the very difficult conversations of what does a multicultural society really look like, if not assimilation into a culturalistness, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's another, your answers make me want to unpack so much more.
A bit of a rabbit hole, but
yeah,
that's the fun
but
of
no,
it.
it's great. You're such an eloquent speaker and such a great representation of a new generation of really, I call them social justice warriors. I mean, I think you can take whatever term you want, but people who have a different perspective on what we need to do. And I think that sort of moves into the food sovereignty work that you're doing. And that's a big part of the conversation today, and how it relates then to immigration and refugees, how it relates to media and knowledge, and how it challenges the system. But just to, as a basic starting point, what is the food sovereignty movement, and what's your sort of involvement in it, and how did you get involved at this point?
So that's a really big and complex question that we could unpack for hours, to be honest. I find that the food sovereignty movement has a lot of branches or arms of it, so to speak. The specific branch or the arm that I'm connected to through the Iye Collective is that we're really focusing on the intersection of food sovereignty and cultural integration for communities of color, Indigenous communities, and our disenfranchised communities that exist here on Canadian land and Canadian soils. That includes immigration or immigrants and refugee populations as well. And in terms of food sovereignty, like when we really boil it down, what we're talking about is our relationship to the production, consumption, and culture surrounding food. Many of the food sovereignty movements that currently exist in Victoria and Canada-wide are usually white-led and catered towards folks who are interested in gardening within white communities, which there's nothing wrong with that. That's wonderful. And also, food holds a very fundamental part of sovereignty and restorative justice for a lot of the communities which exist within the disenfranchised communities. So when we're working within the Iye Collective, food sovereignty just doesn't just mean growing our own food and making sure that we have food security here on the island by learning how to be in reciprocal relationship to our land. It also means reclaiming, re-understanding, reformatting, and engaging the process of, there was this man, Ronald Wall, who put this in a very eloquent way, and I like to quote him on it. He says that to think in a regenerative capacity means that we have to reframe our approach from using questions as a means towards arriving to better answers, and reframing that towards using our answers as a means towards arriving to better questions. So this understanding that we don't have the answers of what food sovereignty means for our communities, but each answer that we arrive to that allows us to ask better questions that are very nuanced and complex in their nature allows us to integrate more and more understandings and expand upon it, kind of like an ecosystem. In the permaculture approach, we often talk about the fact when a new plant pops up that you don't understand, or a new challenge pops up that you don't understand, it's not necessarily an issue or a blockage, but rather a great gateway towards understanding the ecosystem in which you exist and how to relate to it more reciprocally. And I think of it the same way when we continue to ask these questions around food sovereignty, food security, and what it means. Food sovereignty is connected to culture, it's connected to stories, it's connected to justice, it's connected to the sacred for a lot of cultures as well. It's connected to health, it's connected to land management. So really, to me, food production, food distribution, and food culture is the nexus upon which a lot of our social justice movements actually pivots on. And it's something that is shared amongst every human being on the face of this planet. If you're alive, you eat. And to start asking the questions of, where does my food come from? How is it grown? Which communities either benefit or are disenfranchised by the food systems that we exist in? What does food apartheid mean? You know, a lot of us have heard this concept of food deserts, but food apartheid is a relatively new word to be brought into the framework, because it suggests that the systems of food deserts that we see are not by accident, they are by design. And they often impact certain communities differently than other communities. And beyond that, here on the island, and I think COVID really amplified this and brought this more to people's awareness, here on the island as a collective within all of our communities, as as an entire region, we come to understand that the fact that we only produce 6% of the food that we eat on this island is an incredibly backwards way of doing things, right? So it challenges us to reimagine what are our systems of economy and trade and exchange that exist within our communities and community resilience? What other options are there? How do we manage our land? Who does this land belong to, and under whose stewardship and cooperation should we really be being led? It starts to pose questions that brings more light onto land back movements and Indigenous sovereignty. I mean, even within the permaculture world, this is something I like to bring up often. Permaculture is not an innovation of the British men who put together the books of permaculture. Permaculture is a conglomeration of Indigenous land stewardship techniques that have been being embodied and practiced by Indigenous tribes globally. When I was living amongst the Bedouins, I saw permaculture principles being applied in the way that they related to their land, not just in the growing of the food, but in the ways that they treated their animals, the ways that they understood the wild plants that they grow. And this is common across the entire planet. When you walk in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, they are not the way that they are by accident. There were thousands of years of Indigenous tribes on these lands using food forestry and reciprocal land relationships to build the land that we exist on. So the food sovereignty movement is really saying that when it comes to food, when it comes to land, these are things that should be orchestrated and done within a restorative capacity within our communities. In my opinion, should be led by the people whose lands we exist on in cooperation with the communities that are here. And when it comes to looking at food sovereignty from BIPOC lens, a lot of the immigrant populations, the refugee populations, the Black communities, a lot of these communities, there's a lot of knowledge loss that has happened through different traumatic experiences, and it's different for each community. This is something that we talk about in the panels and in the documentary that I most recently did called Food is Connection.
You're jumping ahead. I'm going to stop you because we're going to get into all of that too.
Okay, we'll pause there.
Yeah, no, but it's so good because you're such an eloquent speaker and you're able to really tie all of these things in together. But just for people who don't know, what is the Iye Collective? And just what's the Iye Collective? And then we'll break down a few of the other things.
Yes, the Iye Collective is a beautiful initiative.
Sorry.
It's only been around for 2 years, so we're really a baby. And it's only 4 people really behind the scenes. We have an incredible network of connections and collaborators throughout this community, and we consider it the larger family. But at Iye, we are focused on food sovereignty, food security, and land-based connection. And so we have a conglomeration of different initiatives that we work on, in which we work in a community-led approach. So all of our solutions that we come from are really based on conversations with our communities, and we work mostly with the BIPOC community and the low-income community out here. And we design programs which are focused on supporting land connection, land stewardship, and restoration of food sovereignty and food connection as well. And so right now we have about 4 projects on the go. The Palenque projects are the ones that have been running for the past 2 years. So Palenque Greens is an initiative that was founded by Jess Barton and Ariel Reyes, who are the co-founders of the Iye Collective. And it's focused on creating opportunities for people who don't have access to land to create a completely barrier-free way of engaging in gardening and food sovereignty within their households. So we use the Afro-Indigenous technique of burlap sack gardens. Installation is free, education is free, the burlap gardens are free, and we can install them for you anywhere in the city. We'll bring it to your house, have the conversations, and it's really based on community. All of our movements are, and when we say community, it's not a platitude to talk about serving our people. It's real life relationships. Like, we know your names, we make you food, you bring us food. Like, it's a family. And we often say this at Iye, we're not a company, we're a family. And we're really focusing on trying to create systems that are decolonized, but not in a way necessarily that fits within a framework of what decolonization means, but really moving on the principles of abundance, reciprocity, and community care, and reimagining our systems of design and business to reflect this regenerative way of being in relationship. And our most recent 2 projects that we're working on, in which Astia, my colleague, and myself, and my sister as well, are working on, is a media project, which is highlighting the storytelling aspects and beginning a dialogue on the rehumanization of our conversation around food and food sovereignty and what this means within our communities. And Astia is working on community-led based research that's going to be extending for years and years to come, about looking into public policy and what all of the things that we're learning through story, communication, and our initiatives with the burlap sack garden Gardens and the Produce Box initiative, which is a free food delivery service that we've been doing since October of last year for low-income folk. What does this all look like when we ground it into public policy? And how do we educate our youth in terms of getting involved in public policy and amplifying people's voices rather than speaking on behalf of the people of our community? Yeah.
Wow, so great. And Iye Robinson, I'll just give her a quick shout. She did a panel discussion with Canada's Social Changemakers for the Black Lives Matter series, and she is just this incredible speaker who it was just she's such a fierce advocate as well. So, but that's great work that you're, but there's so much more. I want to get back into that too, but let's just talk about the media project for a second. What is this media project? I mean, I know a little bit because I've already seen a couple of the documentaries, but for the viewers who haven't yet, what is the media project?
For the viewers that haven't, I'm going to say this, no matter how eloquent I am, I could never describe it better than it communicates itself as it is watched. So please, if you're curious, watch it. But beginning in December, we began on a project called Food is Connection, which is a storytelling project which wove the stories together of 6 folks within our community involved in food sovereignty, land connection, and so on and so forth. In terms of not just what is the work that they are doing and the importance of the work they are doing, but their personal relationships and experiences of what food and food connection means within their bodies, within their families, their communities, and their relationship to the divine. And so we began off with that one with a series called Food is Connection. And in there, we explore all of the aspects of it, like how is food related to justice? How is food related to our bodies of land? How is food related to Indigenous sovereignty and reconciliation? And in these stories, we are not having 1 or 2 people speaking on behalf of based on research. It's actually coming from the voices and the mouths and the hearts of the people who belong to these communities from varied parts of these communities. And the intention is to spark a dialogue. We're not providing you with the be-all, end-all answers, but rather we are rehumanizing the experience of it while also focusing on what we call impact-focused, community-focused, participatory-focused filmmaking. So we're not just creating art, but the art in and of itself, the way that our projects are designed, engage the participation of our communities and follow up with tangible impact that can be applied where we are. And so within that, this larger project that we're doing that is called Living in Liberation will be a 6-part docu-series, the first episode of which is Food is Connection. And then moving on, we're going to be exploring food is land, food is body, food is culture, food is justice, and food is sacred. And each one is going to have about a 35-minute storytelling documentary accompanied with 3 tutorials from 15 to 25 minutes in terms of tangible skills and sets that can be applied in people who are starting to engage this process for themselves within the community, ranging from everything in terms of how to build soil, how to plant your own food, how to harvest your own food, how to wild harvest, how to understand the intersection of Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous justice alongside with policy and engagement. It's going to be covering a lot of ground, and it's still in the design process, so I can't get too much into the details, but it's going to be very, very interesting. And we're working in tandem with the community-led research component that is being done by Iye Robinson, in a sense where Iye and I gather every week and we exchange what we are learning. My side is the qualitative research and her side is the quantitative research. And we believe in approaching all of the projects in EA like permaculture settlement in and of itself. So in permaculture, we often talk about this principle of utilizing the margins. So there is a margin to my work that is a limitation in storytelling, which is gathering the quantitative research is kind of a limitation for me. And on her end, the qualitative research is really quite challenging because you've got to be quite pragmatic and to the point with data sets and so on and so forth. So her and I exchange the content we are learning to help curate our design, our questions, and our conversations more effectively. And we're going to be having a series of events that are going to be held throughout the summer called Palenque Socials, where we're going to be doing guerrilla screenings of the documentaries and gathering people together to break bread and have real life conversations of how these things play out in day-to-day life. What kind of things are people concerned about, impact, so on and so forth. And of course, this always intersects with the work that we do with the Palenque section of EA, in terms of being able to offer people tangible solutions like burlap sack vertical gardens or free produce boxes and so on and so forth, and connecting members of our community and our youth and engaging them in the process of the filmmaking to create those networks and amplify those voices.
That's amazing. Yeah, and it really speaks to So many things. I mean, again, it's a lot to break down, and now I'm going to throw some big words at you that I think are I don't know, trigger words for some people, but words like neoliberalism, colonialization, climate change, environmental degradation, and agro-business, capitalism. You know, these are these big blanket terms, and it's very overwhelming for some people who don't necessarily feel that these systems represent them, us, or and it's very hard to challenge. You know, we feel as individuals that how can we challenge the man and these systems that exist? But in my mind, food sovereignty is one of the key aspects of how we actually do challenge all of these things: colonialization, capitalism, neoliberalism, climate change, because the neoliberal capitalist system really focuses on food exchange as a commodity, as and you can see it in the way that Monsanto operates, in Bill Gates buying up properties around the United States. He's now one of the largest landowners. Like, why is this computer guy buying up all this land, involved in the India food riots from behind the scenes? So it's about money and it's about power. And as we have climate change, and as we have you know, COVID, which created food insecurity, you can see the grocery stores, the prices rise very quickly. We have the cost of oil, petroleum shipments from bringing food from Central and South America or wherever to North America. So there's a lot of systems behind the scenes. And food sovereignty, when you have local people growing food who are not dependent then on going to the grocery store, who are not dependent on GMO foods, it really challenges the powers that be. And I know that's a huge question. That was actually a statement, but I'll turn it into a question. How does food sovereignty challenge the system?
You know, I was watching a very fascinating conversation with Wade Davis a few days ago on the topic of what it means to be human. And one of the things that he was speaking to was the principle of culture, and how culture is something that, while we don't recognize it as being a staple of the Western world, you know, we don't look at capitalism as culture. We look at it as an economic system, right? However, it's become one of the mainstays of our cultural systems. And the culture of capitalism is one that is extractive and competitive, right? And so those become the main cultural values of a capitalistic society, of a capitalistic world, something that is expanding to become a global culture, not just a Western culture. This is something that I'm seeing unfold in Jordan. It's something I'm seeing unfold in almost all of the countries and the communities that I'm connected to on a global scale. It's the approach of life which is extractive. We look at life, we look at the human being as a vehicle of extraction, and then the human being in and of itself becomes a resource to extract for whatever benefits, and be it power, be it money, be it whatever else it may be. And in all honesty, I think that one of the big points that he brought up that I really appreciated is, when it comes to cultural beliefs, when it comes to culture in general, what is of less importance than whether or not the beliefs of that culture are true or not, whether or not you look at the mountain and you see it as a resource to be extracted or as one of the gods. The question is not so much who is right. The question is, what kind of a human does that belief produce, and what kind of a world will that human create as a result of that belief system? And so when it comes to all of these larger systemic beliefs and these larger systemic cultures, because when we talk about these things, when we talk about capitalism, when we talk about neoliberalism, all of these different things, we're talking about emerging cultures that are a conglomeration of a belief system that is becoming widespread and agreed upon. Now, when it comes to food sovereignty, when it comes to bringing people back into connection to the process of growing food, harvesting food, preparing food, creating food in community, immediately a lot of these beliefs become challenged. When you are working in a garden, when you are working in an ecosystem, the approach of extraction is unsustainable. It doesn't work in the long run. If you're actually trying to grow food in a sustainable, sovereign, and secure way, there is a requirement for reciprocity. And extraction and reciprocity cannot coexist amongst each other. It's impossible. In order to have reciprocity Everything that you take, you must return in some respect, in some way or another one. So on a cultural standpoint, I think the very act of engaging with and learning and trying to work with the natural landscapes will teach us that this extractive culture in and of itself exists only in the framework of human belief. There's nothing else in this world that operates under that framework. Even, the predators that we often look at and we idealize, like the wolf of Wall Street, right? If we truly understand wolf dynamics and wolf packs, and we've lived with wolves out in the wild, their relationship as hunters is that they give back a lot of what they hunt back into their ecosystem. They do not hoard for themselves. That is not the way that it works. They would not be able to survive if it was as such, because that which they hunt, if it dies off and if it can't survive and be sustainable and sovereign in and of itself, they lose their resources. You hurt your community, you hurt yourself. In terms of systemic change, just on a very basic level, our food systems and our subsidies that we put into the agricultural businesses that we now have, what that is doing to our ecologies, how that intersects with land ownership and indigenous sovereignty and climate change and so on and so forth. If we begin to relocalize our food production and start asking the questions of what different kinds of land tending techniques can we use in these areas, we take a massive amount of pressure off of the agricultural lands that are now being decimated in the face of our monocrop capitalistic food system. And honestly, this is something that I have been saying from the mountaintop since I was 16 years old. The power that the powers that be have is us. And this is something that's very easy to forget, and it's very overwhelming, and it's almost like too much. It makes a lot of people, including myself, feel kind of helpless and shut down, because you realize I am one person of millions of people that are being extracted for power, money, attention, resources, belief systems, so on and so forth. However, I think that as we start to have these conversations and come back into community and focus on food sovereignty and reclaiming our ability to feed ourselves, clothe ourselves, care for ourselves, we begin to realize that if we do not engage in these systems in and of themselves collapse. There was a recognition that I came to at the end of my political science degree, in which I recognized fighting a system that already exists, while it is important to advocate and to stand up and to protest and to instigate a policy change, is not enough. The system that we currently exist in is unsustainable in and of itself. It is bound to collapse, whether or not people enforce it to collapse, because its very nature, its extractive nature, is not sustainable. It has a time limit on how long it can last. The consequences of what happens if we let it run its course are very, very high price to pay, but that is the nature of it in and of itself. And what I have seen, being a woman from the Swana region, is that revolution is inevitable. Collapse is inevitable of every civilization. Now, what ends up happening in this cycle of revolution is each time the powers that be collapse, there is a vacuum of power. And in that vacuum of power, often those that are hungry for power will rise and then create a system which replicates the system which existed before, but it's just a little bit better than last time, so that it doesn't get torn down as quickly, right? You placate the masses, and then therefore you get some power for a while longer before another revolution comes. And in my opinion, and of course I'm open to this being challenged, because God knows I'm learning just as we're going, just as everybody else, and we're trying something completely new here, is that in order for that vacuum of power to not be replaced with another system of centralized power, we need to start working on building an alternative. So when the systems do collapse, there is another option which is already alive and thriving and can be walked into. And when it comes to food sovereignty, when we begin to create networks of community resilience and community exchange and community abundance, not only do we free ourselves of the shackles of dependence on these systems, because, my colleague, my brother, Ariel, who I work with in Iye, in a documentary said this quite beautifully. He said, when you are living in a constant cycle of oppression and you can't afford food and you can't afford rent, you don't have time to think about this stuff. You're angry, you know that something is wrong, but where do you get the time and the resources and the energy in which to actually address the issues that are coming forward? You don't have time. And we hear this oftentimes. It's like, listen, this is all great. I would love to make a difference, but I've got bills to pay and kids to feed, and I don't have time to make these changes. And as we begin to build systems of community abundance and support and exchange and resilience through growing our own food, transforming our cityscapes and our urbanscapes to become more habitable and more abundant in feeding our people, and we take we take the capitalistic pressure of money off of something that is a basic human right, which is food, and that becomes something that we learn how to exchange within our communities, we create the time, we create the nourishment, we create the resources within people to start asking these harder questions and to be working together. It's all about relationship. It's all relational. Everything is relational. Even these powers that be, you know, that are so extractive, it is a relationship. I've used this before in the past, that if you were to take the relationship that we have with, say, Bill Gates, and you were to put it into a microcosm of like your friend comes over and is telling you about her boyfriend, and her boyfriend treats her in the way that Bill Gates treats the mass populations of people here, you would look at her and you'd be like, girl, get out of that. That sounds like a really abusive relationship. We are collectively in a relationship of abuse in the way that our systems and our societies are being run. So if it's a relational issue, the solutions lay in our relationships to each other. And if we can begin to understand that those relationships do not mean coming into this idyllic world where everybody just agrees and cooperates with each other, because let's be real, that's not what it is. There's a lot of stuff in the ground that needs to work, but it's focusing on, like, we know we have conflict. So how do we begin to engage, rather than imagining a perfect world, saying, how do we engage in conflict resolution? How do we get down and dirty and work with each other in a way where we're open, we're listening, we're using our answers as a means to getting better questions and integrating culture, rather than trying to create a monoculture in and of itself, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, that's speaking my language right there. And you're so eloquent in the way that you deliver all of these points. And one of the other ways that, because you were talking about the media project and Food is Connection, and one of the goals, I think, is to really get that message out there in a way that also challenges our media and traditional news consumption. And so maybe we can just sort of echo on that, because it's all connected, really, the way that we consume food, the way that we consume media, the way that we're sort of bombarded with a particular viewpoint. And as I've said numerous times in my interviews throughout Canada, the news media that we consume is very concentrated in terms of the ownership. You know, there's basically 6 corporate bodies that own most of the media and news that we consume. And there's a very strong purpose behind that media in the way that we consume it, in order to keep people fear-based, in order to keep people at the lowest common denominators, in order to keep people focused on being angry at immigrants and refugees and the lower economic classes, rather than, you know, the people who actually hold the power. And anytime these people sort of rise, they're often shunned and shunned by the media. And anytime you have sort of, let's say, one progressive voice, you have 3 very strong counter voices being the dominant voices within that system. And so what you're doing with the media project, again, challenges that power structure. And so can you talk about that again a little bit, please?
Comically enough, that's not my intention, but I guess inherent in it is a result, right?
It's a result.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is a big piece of it. I mean, I think we exist now in a time that is very unique in contrast to what it has been, because what we're seeing right now is the remnants of an old system that has gotten really huge, really inflated. However, it's growing at the same time as we are also seeing that that inflation that we have of technology, social media, all of these different platforms that now exist also give voices as well. Now, you know, I often see this narrative, this idea of like the conspiracy theorists versus the realists and so on and so forth about media, about narratives. And I've seen this written out a few times in a couple of different dialogues I've witnessed online, this idea of like, do you really believe that it's possible that a few people are forcing all of these independent people to say the same thing all the time? I was like, no, of course not. But the nature of narrative and the nature of storytelling is that if we are told a story enough times, we begin to believe it is truth, and then we begin to tell the stories that we in and of ourselves believe. And so one of the things that I'm hoping with this project is like, guys, I didn't go to film school. This has never been like, I studied medicine for a very long time, you know. However, I find myself in this position of understanding that storytelling holds a power that we often underestimate. I think the power of story is that it is the one thing that allows us to unite in numbers beyond just personal relationships towards a common understanding, and to reach a place of empathy, compassion, and recognizing that that while your pain and your struggle and your challenges and your vulnerabilities might sound very different than mine, at the heart we share them through a different story, but the same narrative in and of itself. And so my hope with this work is to challenge the fact that the majority of these mass media sources, while they may seem to be telling many, many, many stories, they're telling the same narrative. It's a divisive narrative. It's this idea based on ideology rather than human reality, you know? And I see this often happening, this division of like, you're either liberal or you're conservative, you're left wing or you're right wing, you believe in coronavirus or you don't believe in coronavirus, like so on and so forth. It's this very polarized way of understanding things because it's not based on human experience. It's based on ideology and value systems and principles which are held on to as if they are identity. And so my intention with this work is to put down the ideology, put down the value system fight, and rather have just a really roots conversation of like, what does this mean to you? Why do you believe these things? What are the stories that your positions come from? You know, it's not about creating an echo chamber. I'm not trying to find a million people who all believe food sovereignty is the most important thing in the world. I would love to have conversations with people who believe food sovereignty doesn't mean anything and then understand why. What else do you have to add into this conversation? And my intention is that through my own experience of coming into this as somebody who gets imposter syndrome all the time, right, is to empower and to say to people who are like me and not like me as well, is that your voice matters. And the idea is not that we are here to tell other people's stories. We are here to create spaces in which other people's stories can be amplified through our platforms and through our frameworks. And so I think the only real way to challenge these media sources is to use our voices to diversify the conversations that are being had. And this is a personal stance. I'm not saying this is the truth. This is my truth. I often find that trying to change systems from the inside out is a very challenging way to go about creating change. I often find if the system itself doesn't work, design a new one. And the changes that we need to see coming, there is no one size fits all. There is no one way to change the narratives and the stories that are being told, but rather there needs to be an ecosystem, a variety of different responses, a variety of different designs for storytelling, because every community has a very unique body of challenges that they are facing. And this is one of the things that came up in our conversations within the Food is Connection project, is this understanding, for example, when we're talking about food sovereignty, the obstacles that individuals face in engaging in food sovereignty in different communities vary greatly. Therefore, the solutions for each community has to be designed in a different framework. Does this mean that they are competitive? No, it means they are cooperative. This is the nature of an ecosystem way of thinking. It's this understanding that each individual ecosystem needs different things in order to be nourished. If I'm a desert, I'm not going to need the same things that a Pacific Northwest rainforest needs, right? And so within that, we talked about this a lot about the food sovereignty movement, the kinds of spaces that need to be created for folks of the African diaspora and the former enslaved is going to be very different than that which is needed within Indigenous communities, because the challenge with Indigenous communities is that they are fighting for their sovereignty to get back to their land and to have the right to embody their practices. Within the communities of the African diaspora and the formerly enslaved communities, there is a trauma and a fear of returning back to the land, which I also see within my community. You know, it's this idea of our grandparents worked so hard that we would never have to be the ones farming the land again. And then I show up to my grandma and I'm like, I'm working in food sovereignty and farming. And she's like, God damn it, why? We worked so hard that you wouldn't have to be a farmer, right? So there's all kinds of different challenges that are faced in different communities. And therefore, in the storytelling aspect of it as well, in the media, in the narratives, the solutions that are required for each community are going to be different for each community. So my encouragement is, if you have a voice and you have something to say it, mobilize, get together with your community. That's the way we change the narrative. Now, there is a behemoth in front of us, because there is a massive amount of people that derive most of their knowledge of this world from these main media sources. But it's just about having human conversations and creating alternatives, in my opinion, and advocating for breaking apart some of these behemoths as much as we can. And for those of us that have the courage, the patience, and the tolerance to go within the system and try to inject different narratives, all the power to you. I personally do not have that level of patience. But for the people that do, that's necessary too. We need people on every single level who have the intention of rehumanizing and diversifying our narratives and our storylines, and trying to challenge this divisive perspective of our world and rehumanizing it. And again, this is an unbelievable feat of measure that we have never seen. It's unprecedented, because just the sheer amount of people that exist in our communities these days, and the ability to mobilize and have the heart bandwidth and the mind bandwidth to be able to take into consideration so many different people's experiences is huge. So it doesn't come without challenge, right?
Yeah, we just dipped our toes into so many different aspects of this conversation, and there's so much more conversation to be had. But this is just a starting point to hopefully create more conversation for other people watching this. If you want to get involved in any of the work, Jumana, where can they find out more about you, about Food is Connection? I'm going to say it wrong, but the Iye movement, and yeah, all of the different resources. Where can they learn?
If you want to get in touch with me and the work that I'm doing right now, I'm best accessed through Instagram or Facebook. And my name is written, I believe, on this interview. So it's just my name. If you're looking for me on Instagram, it's Jumana.Risheq. And if you're looking for me on Facebook, it's just my name. For Iye, we've got a page for that as well.
Iye.
It's actually based off of a song. I'll send you the song. It's called Mama Iye. But it's Iye.her stories on Instagram and also on Facebook. And we've just started to launch a website as well. So I'll send that along to you, Justin, and then you can throw it in.
Yeah, I'll put everything in the links below for sure.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. And so, yeah, just get in touch with us if you're interested. We are a growing community. We are a growing family. We love to have dialogues and conversations. In the next few months, we'll be launching a Living in Liberation page as well, where we'll be sharing a lot of the conversations we're having conversations with leaders in the food sovereignty movement all over Canada and all over America. And we're even going to be featuring artists from the diaspora from all over the world as well, and different pieces like this. So just get in touch and we'll get connected. Yeah,
the work that you're doing is so inspiring to me, and I think probably to so many others. Food sovereignty, alternative media, immigration and refugee rights, land sovereignty, Indigenous rights, BIPOC perspectives. There's so many different facets to the conversation that we had today, and I just appreciate it so much. The work that you do, again, is really, it touches my soul as someone who did work in the system and banged my head against a wall over and over again until I felt like I had to leave and find my own voice. And that's why the series came about, is really trying to offer alternative perspectives and have these conversations to people who are open to hearing them and engaging in them. And you and people like Asiya and so many others are really leading the way for the next generation. So thank you for taking the time to speak with me today. I appreciate it more than you could possibly know.
Thank you so much, Justin. I really appreciate the time.